Sociology and Business Law Department of Bologna University. And today I'm truly glad to welcome this international conference titled Emerging Platform Society. Our department strongly believes in international projects like the UNIVO and the IITK research group, as these activities give us the chance to collaborate with foreign institutions such as the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur in India. They represent an important opportunity to broaden the UNIVO scientific and civic horizons, and to host esteemed personalities such as Mille, we have him here today, and all the lecturers we will see in the next 3 days, to whom we are very thankful again for their availability and the interest in participating into this important conference. The topics that we discussed together in the conference will concern digital consumption, digital money, media, and related physical-digital phenomena that are all of high interest as well as crucial in current times. So we are very excited to host different debates here in our department, and all the ideas that will emerge during the event and during the discussions. So with this said, we are very looking forward to the international conference lectures, and I will now leave the floor to Professor Giorgio Del Desposi for the introduction to the conference. And I just appreciate once again the presence of Daniel Mille here today.
Sorry for stepping in front of the camera. Thank you very much, Claudia, for the kind introduction and for the institutional greetings. Hi everybody, I just want to introduce you our project, UNIVO IITK Digital Sociology Research Group, which is basically a blended research group between here University of Bologna and Kanpur Indian Institute of Technology. This conference is organized by our group, which is represented by me, Giorgio Del Desposi in University of Bologna, and by Professor Mille in University of Kanpur. She is online at the moment. Hi Gillette, if you would like to say some greetings, feel free to jump in. For those who don't know us, I will briefly introduce with few sentences what we are doing. This project consists of an academic cross-cultural team that aims to investigate different aspects of emerging platform society with a specific focus on physical-digital transformation. In other words, our focus is to deepen the study of hybridization phenomena in the context of transition, while opening the debate to a wider public, also thanks to an open access website, as well as some international events like the conference we are hosting today. If you want to check our activity, it's enough you Google UNIVO IITK, we are the first result on Google. The URL is kind of complex, but we will share during the conference. As previously mentioned, this conference is held in blended modality. Therefore, I want to thank both the presence of online participants as well as you that are here in presence with us. Now, moving on the first day of our institutional conference, we couldn't not imagine a better start than having Professor Daniel Mille here with us, that truly represent an added value to the event. Now I leave the floor to you, Daniel. We are very glad to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning here, and also to people in Kanpur. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. I'm delighted to be here. And the main topic that we're concerned with over the next few days are platforms. And nobody, in a sense, has the right to determine the meaning of a word. So we have to recognise that the word platform maybe have a more technical meaning in certain parts of sociology. Also, it's a general term that people use. So there are approaches emerging, so a very influential book about the platform society, and concerns with its implications for the sort of ecology of platforms, with the corporations, how it reflects wider values in society. But more generally, I think the term has come to be used within considerations of the digital almost as synonymous with kind of apps. That effectively people say, oh, we have all these different platforms, they mean effectively we have all these different apps. And that colloquial use is also interesting, and that it implies that although there are digital platforms, that we all knew that even before the digital, we could understand the world through something analogous to the digital platform. There were platforms before the digital. And the perspective that we are hoping to bring, myself and Shireen Wharton is here with us, is really an anthropological perspective that complements the more, if you like, top-down concern with like the corporations and those kind of influences, with what you might think of as a bottom-up, in the sense of it is primarily concerned with experience, with what are the ultimate consequences of all of this for the lives of the people that we work with. Because for us, that's what matters, right? Ultimately, what difference does it make to the people you see all around you? And our aim is to focus upon that and make sure that that is a consideration within the overall approach to this. So let me start, however, with an acknowledgement that this is a collaboration between Italy and India. Because, as it happens, I had previously worked, before the digital, I had a couple of books that actually were based in India, and one of those books was about an Indian garment called the sari. And one of the things that we noticed, because we were investigating the sari, had many beautiful fabrics and colours, it's not what we were concerned with. We were concerned with the sari as a platform. And in particular, what difference did that platform make to the experience of Indian women? And the contrast I will draw, because I am actually wearing the first slide, okay? As it happens, most of my shirts come from a shop in India called Fab India, because I like their shirts. But I am wearing a typical male garment, the shirt. And once I put it on in the morning and decided to give this lecture with that shirt, I am stuck with it, right? That's it as a platform. It's fixed. And that, even if I go to a different environment where I would have preferred to have a different shirt, I don't have a different shirt, right? This is the platform for the day and affects my experience. Now, the interesting thing about the sari in India is that that is not the case, because the sari has a part of the sari goes over the shoulder, it's called the pallu. And because it has the pallu, an Indian woman can use her garment in all sorts of creative and different ways during the course of the day. She can show something by whether she's pinned it or not pinned it, confidence in the way that it falls on the shoulder. She can use it, if she's Muslim, to veil herself in front of strangers, or if she's Hindu, to veil herself in front of older male relatives. She can clasp it and show she's being clear as a teacher. She can use it in office politics. There are so many ways in which that garment can be utilised as a platform that makes it a completely different platform from this shirt. So already, before we even get to the digital, we can see that when we use the word platform, it's a base. But that base has different consequences, depending on the nature of that base. And exactly the same will be true when we come to the digital, when we try to do this consideration of apps. So on my phone, I have an app that tells me what stars I am looking at night. I have an app that listens to bird song and tells me what the species of the bird is that I am listening to. I love these apps, but that's all they do, right? They are, if you like my show. They're there, they're given, that's the app. On the other hand, the world of apps concludes things that actually, of themselves, have multiple possibilities and uses. Perhaps the other end of the spectrum would be the Chinese app, WeChat. It can basically do almost anything, from ordering your dinner, to seeing the doctor, to having your conversations, to playing games, all actually within the app. So that's more, if you like, a SARI platform that actually can be manipulated according to the particular circumstances that you are in. And our concern is that, not just that there are these key differences within what we are calling the platform, but they have consequences. Now, our research has been based on an appreciation that in a way we're already moved beyond the consideration of things like social media, because in effect we now live in a world where what we once called social media are now really just a bunch of apps. And they are apps in juxtaposition with other apps. And the reason for that is our primary point of access is the smartphone. So actually, in whatever other platforms we are considering, it will be strange not to also investigate the fundamental platform, which is the smartphone itself, and the consequences that has for the configuration of all the other apps. And one of the reasons it's so important is literally the physical juxtaposition. If you have a whole lot of apps and they're a button from each other, a centimetre, that has consequences for one's understanding of the app. For example, it means that when we were doing our research in our book, The Global Smartphone, on a sector such as health, we found that the temptation, when you are studying platforms, is to be focused on the world according to platforms. And so if you're coming out of communication and internet studies, you tend to think in terms of these platforms. But we think in terms of people's lives. And the difference that having the smartphone as the ultimate platform here has made is that actually when we then look at how people use these things, they actually are not thinking about apps as platforms to the degree that we might have imagined. Because they are so close to each other, for them it's easy to just go from one to another. So actually, people are more concerned with their tasks, the things they want to achieve, right? So in health, they may want to organise something to do with an illness they have, but that will include dealing with the insurance, looking up the symptoms, finding an appointment with the doctor. And actually, because of that, they will shift from app to app to app and configure them according to their tasks, so what they are aiming to do that they actually need. Which means that their conception of the things is much less app in the sense of platform-based, because it's been superseded by smartphone as the platform base, which allows them to amalgamate these and quickly shift, looking something up, and the next button is, oh, then I make an appointment, and the next button is, in that case, I have to sort out insurance. And with a lot of the older people we deal with don't even necessarily know the proper way. So they may think, oh, I've got to send something for insurance. I'll use my camera, and then I'll copy that into something else, and I will load, because they find a workaround. And in the end, they manage to send to the insurance company what the insurance company wants. But it wasn't the way the insurance company planned it to be. So the insurance company app would have led them to do it a different way. But they don't care. What they care about is getting the money back for what they were doing, right? So they will develop their own configuration around these different apps, but they can do so because they have a smartphone. So for us, it made sense to move the agenda a bit and say, actually, maybe what we really need to be focused on right now is understanding what the hell is a smartphone. And that is not a straightforward question, because as you start to investigate this beast, two things follow. One, is it a phone? And two, is it smart? It's not really a phone. I mean, a phone was something, you know, we used to use to speak to people. And today, so a young person, I doubt 5%, a 20th of their usage is anything like a phone, right? 95% is all sorts of other things that you couldn't do with a phone. So calling it a phone really doesn't help. It's not a phone. It can be a phone amongst many other things, but it's not a phone. More interesting, is it smart? Because the term smart tends to imply a world. I mean, originally it's an acronym that talked about, you know, how you get feedback, so the device itself is learning from the way it's being used. And now we are fixated on, you know, algorithms and artificial intelligence and all the things these things can do. But our job is to look at what ordinary people actually do. And yes, it's true, when you use your smartphone, it may predict what you are looking up or learn from what you looked up before. But to be honest, in terms of the overall study of what this is used for, these are not major characteristics. Maybe they will be one day, but actually that is not at the core of our relationship with smartphone. So despite all the things about algorithms and AI, maybe important in the construction of the thing, they're not necessarily the right thing to focus on. So if it's not a phone and it's not a smart, what is it? Our argument is that, as with the SARI, what is important is understanding how people transform this in consumption, in usage. Because what is unprecedented about this device is the degree to which it's transformable by its users. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Because when we had done all our study, we had to try and think, well, of all the things you could say a smartphone is, what maybe is the single most important for really getting people to start thinking about this actively, instead of taking it from terminologies like platforms. And we decided that the most important thing about understanding a smartphone is to understand that it is a place within which we now live. It's a platform for life, and that is analogous with a home. And just as in a bricks and mortar home, we understand it as a place from which many different activities can take place, but also it's the place where we actually are. So, to turn to the slide, the smartphone is a transportal home, because it's also a portal that takes you to other people's smartphone homes as one of its main kind of functions. We might be entertaining ourselves, playing a game, catching up with the news, students doing your research through the phone, gossiping with your friends, thinking about your lesson, or just doing functions, organising your diary, calendar and day. Right? It's not a phone, it's these things that people are doing with this device and that dominate the usage of that device. So that's what it is, okay? But it's also, as I say, it's a place. Where can I find you? I actually don't even know whether you're at your physical home or not. I don't actually care, because I just want to find you. I know you're at home if your phone rings when I contact you, send you WhatsApp or whatever it is. It's understood as a place. And it's not just us who think of it that way. We were intrigued as we were doing our research by the degree to which people in the different field sites where we work also use phraseology. So they would talk about cleaning their phone, like housekeeping, or reorganising because too much rubbish has accumulated and you need to get rid of it in order that it's a cleaner space. I'm here in Italy where people have a good aesthetic of space, which we're very impressed by, and we can imagine that also could occur within the way they think about the aesthetic of their smartphone home. So this actually was from Yaoundé, which is the capital of Cameroon, West Africa, and people talking about cleaning contacts, cleaning the street. But my favourite quote was somebody who said, do you know, I am not going to let that person into my home again. But he meant the smartphone, right? Not the place where he was living. So for us, the platform analogy for the smartphone is fundamentally the home, the platform from which we live, because if we were to think predictably of all the platforms from which we carry out life, the home is clearly of conspicuous importance. So this gives us, I think, a starting point for really thinking about the smartphone as a platform for life. Now, all of the things I'm talking about are based on a research project. It's a research project that was called the Anthropology, it's ASSA, the Anthropology of Smartphones and Smart Aging. It took place between 2017 and will end in October this year. And we carried out, all the people in the team did the traditional ethnographic anthropology. That is to say, we lived in communities for 16 months. And actually, this afternoon, you'll get a sense of the richness of that. Because we also published monographs, such as this one, Aiden's Life in Italy, which Irene will talk about, and she will give you a sense of the depth you gain from carrying out that kind of 16-month research. I am more concerned, if you like, with the breadth of what you gain from having multiple such field sites around the world. And these included Gert in Japan, in China. We have a team working in our goods in Jerusalem. I just mentioned the Yaoundé study in Cameroon, Patrick. We have one in a very, he is working with middle class in Yaoundé. Jean is working with much lower income people in Kampala in Uganda. And then we have Brazil, Chile. And I'm currently, my own study is a joint study in Ireland, and I'm currently working in Trinidad, which I may not get to. We conceptualized this project holistically, because that's what anthropologists do, they kind of study everything, but we were concentrating in particular on three areas. Why were we interested in aging? The reason was that when I first started on comparative studies, working on social media in about 2012, it's hard to believe now, but I promise you, everybody told me that social media would never ever be used by anybody over 40. It was never going to happen, and these phones would never be used by people over 40. I mean, it was absolutely sure. As we now know, I mean, our book starts, I think, with an 80-year-old Japanese flower arranger for whom it's just so integral to everything going on in life, it's already unimaginable to live without it. And the point then is that it stopped then being a youth technology, and so much of the literature about things like social media had been fixated on not just youth, but often attitudes to youth. So, social media was called narcissistic, so older people could tell younger people they're narcissistic, right? But that came back to bite them because they were then using these things, right? And they didn't necessarily want to be themselves as narcissists. So it's really the first opportunity to see this as everybody's platform for life. And we were interested in how that would shift the perceptions we have of this from the more narrow constraints of thinking is related to youth. Obviously, a lot of it, what is the smartphone itself? And we wanted them to, I may not be able to talk about this today, but we also have got a lot of interest in the practical outcomes of our studies, and we have a whole series of health-based initiatives that we are actually engaging in, interventions to actually improve people's welfare and health. That is the final part of it. And these things intersect in many ways. So, for example, recently, if you look at Mille, right, care and surveillance, one of the effects of COVID has been the development of those track and trace technologies. And what they showed, really, the track and trace technologies, is the capacity of the smartphone for surveillance. Think of the extreme ways this is done at the moment in China. And we talked about surveillance anxiety, but boy, do you see it when they're actually using track and trace technologies, but also for care. Because a lot of our work, as I'll come to, was actually about how the smartphone is used for care. And again, the same Chinese government would say, yes, it's surveillance, but it is also an expression of the way the paternalistic government cares for you. And therefore, they really demonstrated the importance of understanding how the smartphone could also express certain, say, contradictions or balances, in this case, between things like care and surveillance. So those are the kind of issues that were likely to come up in our work and did. The background, then, would be an understanding of transformations in aging. Very briefly, what we'd argue is that aging itself has radically transformed, and the smartphone is a player in this, because in a generation ago, age was seen much more in terms of cultural categories. So, for example, in our Palestinian site, still today, people of a certain age, maybe around 50, they change what they wear, they expect to be treated as seniors with wisdom, and they have become a different category of person as a result of the age they have reached. Whereas in several sites, including where I work in Ireland, that's basically gone. People kept saying to me, oh, I thought it would be different when I became 50 or 60 or 70 or 80, but nothing happened. All I see is continuity. And I'm in my 70s, and on Spotify I'm playing the music of the 70s. And nobody regards me now anymore as senior, because they just are interested in my opinion because I've got an opinion, right? There's more, in a sense, equality around it. So the cultural configuration of aging had been replaced by essentially a continuity of age until frailty. And the key point is then frailty. As one gets older, there start to be things that you cannot comfortably do, cannot do, and that then does have significant impacts. And the smartphone was important in this because, in a way, it did the same thing, but almost with a little bit more violence. Because initially, for older people who weren't necessarily comfortable in using smartphones, the smartphone became an object of what we call the digital divide. And you had this ridiculous thing of the governments attacking people for the amount they're using smartphones, saying this is not good for you, it's anti-social or whatever, and at the same time putting everything online so you couldn't actually access services unless you are using it, something like a smartphone, right? And that was oppressive to the people who were thereby excluded. However, and one of the things we did in our fieldwork, several of us actually taught smartphone courses to older people so you could see the way they kind of struggle with smartphones, etc. But we were then interested that if they then, as a result of those classes or whatever, were enabled to have a smartphone, it actually did quite the opposite, which it actually brought them back into that trajectory where they think, well, I'm still basically the same as when I was young, doing now the same things as the young were doing, etc., with their Spotify, etc. So there is an underlying transformation in society going on, but it's also a specific impact of smartphones upon that trajectory, as will be true of many of the things that we are studying. Now, I mentioned earlier that maybe the most interesting thing about the smartphone is the way it can be transformed by its users. So then you investigate the consequences of that, and we come up with another, if you like, theoretical term. We've got transport from home, but we also have something called beyond anthropomorphism. Because what we realise is that the smartphone has a capacity to be integrated into the character of a person in a way that is probably unprecedented. So, for example, in my Irish fields, like, I would be working with a woman who was a consummate professional. Well, at least that's how she saw herself. You know, that she never quite got the job she thought was aligned with her abilities in that respect. But her phone, an iPhone, I mean, once you started looking at it, to pay her electricity bill, there was, it links into websites and the calendar and this long series of notes about all the stages that are involved, and they are all kind of linked together. It's like a 600 life manual in which everything is precisely organised around her life, but it's all expressed. Couldn't express it as fully as she liked in her work, she expressed it most fully in her smartphone. Compared to a man I was dealing with who had a particular kind of masculinity, which is, a sort of minimalist. What is all this stuff? Do I really have to use it? No. For me, it's just I phone and I text. Actually, did more. So as soon as his daughter was no longer in Australia, he wiped Skype off his phone. So the phone then becomes something which is expressive of persons, and if you look at the chapter in the book, equally of relationships, because the reason the wife doesn't have it on her phone is because that's what the husband does, and vice versa. So the gender understandings of couples gets reflected in this. And of course, in turn, that reflects cultural values. Because even that notion of what it is to be masculine differs from society. It would be different maybe in the Philippines or somewhere else. So we are looking at the way the phone is not just expressive, but actually becomes the capacity of a person, if you like, to be themselves, or be that couple, or be exemplary of the cultural values that they actually inhabit. It's called beyond anthropomorphism because a smartphone doesn't have legs and arms and doesn't look much like a person. Right? So it's a different way of understanding that expressiveness than, say, a robot might. We have a chapter in the Global Smartphone really about this kind of expressive capacity of the smartphone. So again, platform for life, right? It is the way people now create, if you like, not just a mirror, but a mirror with amazing capacities to become who they then are. A third example is of the way we not just change in ourselves, but change in our relationship to the world around us. We theorize as perpetual opportunism. Now, previous to this, there was the idea that the mobile phone exhibited perpetual contact. One of the consequences of having a mobile phone is you could always be in contact with somebody else wherever you are. But we actually argue that this is much more than that. Once you have a smartphone in your pocket, you're always aware of the capacities that you now possess, and that can be opportunistic. So you pass a notice about a rock concert you want to go to, and you take a photo of the notice there and then to remember later on, and put it in your calendar when you get home, whatever. You pass an interesting looking scene. There's a clicking in the bus stop. You think, that's funny. You take a picture then and there, and you can share it instantly with the other people who are going to find it funny. Your baby is smiling for the first time, and there are, again, 10 people who just have to see it right there. Okay? So this is, in a sense, an attitude to the world an understanding of the way you can relate to the environment around you, that is essentially constructed around that conception of who you are and what you can do and be, again, that is transformed as a result of having a smartphone. So we live now in this state of perpetual opportunism because it's always with us and we can always do these things, which is a significant difference, I would argue. The point about the global smartphone is it's, on the one hand, has these very specific studies, and again, Shereen will talk to that more this afternoon, but also we were looking at these various generalities, which is probably the main things I have to speak about. But I'll give you a couple more. For sociologists and others interested in things like the nature of family and the historical trajectory around what families are. We would argue, based on our evidence, although it's different for each field site, that historically, as a big generalizations in sociology or elsewhere, you can see that in many societies we have shifted from a more extended family towards a more nuclear family. That traditionally people may have had a wider environment with their cousins, aunts, uncles, etc., and that was assumed to be integral to the way we conceptualized and lived in families. But now, for example, housing presupposes the nuclear, and actually we had also transformed, generally, not everybody, but more towards that. Whereas with the smartphone, particularly when you get developments around things like WhatsApp, you can be re-engaged with wider groups. And actually, when, for example, I was looking at the WhatsApp groups that people had, most people had family WhatsApps, and most people have extended family WhatsApps. And the reason that changes the nature of family is that if in essentially a nuclear family, you see your relatives at Christmas, but it becomes a relatively formal, you haven't seen them for a long time, and even the way you speak to them is relatively informal because it's not a continual relationship. Whereas if they're on WhatsApp and you're WhatsApping back and forth during the course of the year, it becomes that much more informal relationship that actually makes the experience of family that much different. Final one. One of the things we argued, and it came actually from the earlier study of social media as a big generalization, is that this transforms, as a platform, the nature of conversation itself. And the argument is that previously there were essentially two-way modes of conversation. There was oral, I'm speaking to you, there was textual, you're reading this, but that with the rise of social media, the visual becomes not just a form of communication, but it can become conversational. So a popular app in where I am is Snapchat. And Snapchat is literally photo conversation. Because you can actually, with your friend at school, send pictures of your face feeling happy or proud or whatever, all day long, without any words and any text, and it's a conversation. So the way the visual is used, now, I've used many generalizations, but actually what was important to us is that these vary from each of our individual field sites. So this idea of visual communication will be different in a place like Japan, because Japan has a specific historical tradition of the use of the visual, in which they have manga and the development of the emoji, etc. It's going to be different than how this plays to a society that doesn't have those traditions in the use of the visual. And in Laura Hapier's work, She was looking at there, whereas we have WhatsApp and China has WeChat, in Japan the dominant app is called Line, and people are sending unbelievable numbers of stickers day to day, and the kind of things that she was examining in this was the way people use these to extend care. So how somebody would communicate with their grandparents, and then how that expression of care not only plays into the historical traditions of using visual, but also conversation has etiquette around it. Actually, we talk about face-to-face as though it was more natural. It really isn't, right? We know from Goffman and then on that it's surrounded by a thicket of conventions, what we can say and what we can't say. And in Japan is a society where there is a tremendous amount of etiquette around the way you perform yourself in conversation. So when you have a new medium, one of the things that's important about it is not just that it's visual, but also that it's new. So that means that you can actually use it possibly to get round some of these etiquettes or express them in a different way. And that changes the relationship between different groups of people. So what I've kind of concentrated on today is really the headline, as it were, of the global smartphone, i.e. the more general claims that we would make. And as you can see, when I say platform for life, I really mean it, because we've gone from the way you relate to the outer world, the way you relate to yourself, the way you relate to your relationships, the way it becomes the place in which you live. I think platform for life is no exaggeration when you can consider all those different elements. But I ended with an argument which says that actually all of this depends upon the specific place that you did your study. And because I want to take questions, I'm going to sort of end there, but the point I'm making to end there is that there is a balance, a complementarity between what I have been saying and what Shireen will be talking about, because one of our sites happens to be in Italy. And actually, when you go from these broad generalizations to the specifics of a set of populations in a place, then actually you come up with a whole lot of other understandings and ethnographic results about the consequences this has for people that are much better understood in a particular place. And that's why I haven't talked so much about this myself, but that you will talk about this afternoon. And I want to stop there because I want to make sure there's time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for your engaging presentation. Now we have question time, so if someone wishes to jump in with some question, feel free to ask. Meanwhile, I have a first question. Sorry if I look unpolite, but I found a lot of very interesting instance in your talk, and since my main topic of research is presumption, and basically the idea that consumer, or it's way better to say presumer, are engaging in double relationship with the social context, so they are both enabled and exploited by situation and context, and moreover with platforms. I find your idea of the smartphone as a place and a house very engaging, but at the same time I would like to ask you if by some extent, using the same metaphor, none of us is owner in the global digital society of our home. I mean, all of us are renting our apartment from Apple, Google, and those main platforms ruling the digital environment. That, of course, we can customize a lot, but on the other end, we can have like an idea of a Weberian 2.0 in which these places, I mean, these digital homes are also digital cage, as well as there was the iron cage in the classical modern society. I would like your insight about that.
Yes, I think that if you draw an analogy between a smartphone and a home, it should be realistic about a home. Now, a home, traditional bricks and mortar home, was always a cage. You ask a teenager in their home, right, who is under the control of their parents. They have barricaded their room. Parents keep out, right? Because you look at a home where there is conflict between husband and wife, okay? And where that happens in the home, and what is witnessed and not witnessed in relation to those children. You look at the people who have a disability in relation to mobility, and they can't leave them. And you look at lockdown during COVID, where we all felt caged in by our homes, and were desperate in some ways to get out of it. So I don't think that the idea of an analogy with home precludes the things that you are concerned with. Because also in a home, we may be paying a mortgage, which we may not be able to afford. And right now, mortgage rates are about to go up, and we didn't reckon that we would go up as much as they are about to go up, right? So something in that changes our finances, etc. So I think the question you've asked actually reinforces the point about thinking about this analogy and how effective it is. Because actually, a platform for life includes all that life is, for good and for bad, and to the degree to which previously we were under the influence of the political economy isn't changed by the fact that we are engaged through smartphones. It's maybe slightly different political economies, and there are many writers about surveillance society, etc., that are looking at those differences. Having said all that, I still think there is something about the way we are doing the research that I would be insistent on, which is the place where I started, which is the trouble is if you start from the other end and you're focused entirely on the corporations, the neoliberal capitalism, the elements of control, you tend sometimes to draw from that and project onto people in terms of what matters to them and the consequences to them. And we are very insistent that there has to be something else. It is not my authority, because I think this element of the corporation is important, to then say that's what matters to people on the street out there. We have to have that humility, I think, that doesn't allow us simply to project onto people what matters to us in our debates. We also have to have the respect that says, do you know, I will go out there and see. And it may be that something of what we're talking about people care about, and there may be other elements they don't care about at all. And if they don't care about it, and we cannot demonstrate it as consequence, it's not consequential. And so for us, it is always vital to say, hold on, I don't know. I have to find out through an empathetic engagement with people how they understand the consequences of all this. Because otherwise we just don't know the consequences.
Thank you very much. Another question from the floor on the virtual classroom? Please, which girl? Come vuoi, se ti sentono bene perché c'è il microfono direzionale, però se vai davanti ti vedo male, come preferisci.
Okay, thanks Daniel for your terrific talk, and I really appreciate this humility that you have in order to try to understand beyond the stereotype, the prejudice, the categories, what is the life of objects, like in this case. So talking about home, you mentioned the COVID situation, and I was thinking about that we usually think that we stay safe at home. What about homeless or just vulnerable categories? I'm thinking, for example, about some categories like migrants, refugees. I mean, escaping or living abroad, the phone is even more a home.
Mm-hmm.
So can you confirm this about that? And just a couple of questions. And I really appreciate also this idea of seeing the smartphone as home, because it goes beyond the prejudice of alienation, isolation. You say maybe even you can be more in touch with your relatives or whatever. So it's also a critique to these popular critiques towards the alienation of the smartphone. And so how do you relate the idea of care and surveillance, care and control to this kind of critique? And then the last is about methodology. I mean, what kind of methodology do you use to investigate?
Okay. Thank you for your 3 questions. For the first one, I was happy to hear this question about migrants, but Shireen was even happier, because actually the talk this afternoon is going to be about migrants and how they experience the smartphone, because that was the main population in Milan that she worked with. So she will give a much longer and better answer than I could to that. The second question goes to the third question about methodology, very briefly. One of the reasons we are very insistent upon working on this as anthropologists is because quite often in other disciplines, the main medium of methodology is language, or surveys or interviews. And the problem there is that people have a discourse about smartphones. If I ask somebody in the street, tell me about the smartphone, they will talk about surveillance, and they will talk, they know from the newspapers what to talk about, right? They will talk about addiction, they will talk about all these things. But if you, so these are important because they are a property of the, smartphone is the way the smartphone is used as a discourse, which is actually about discussing moral issues in society. That's what that discourse is really about. It's got very little to do with the smartphone. It has to do with how they exploit the smartphone in moral debates about youth, about all these things. And we have a chat with the global smartphone, the discourse about the smartphone. But if you actually want to see what is really happening with the smartphone, the main method that most of us were using was to say that there is a huge discrepancy between what people say and what they do. Mostly, particularly older people, if I ask them about the smartphone, what do you do with your smartphone? Say, nah, not much. I have maybe 2 things I mainly do, texting and right? WhatsApping, texting, let's see. So what we did, we are there for 16 months, and we try and use that time to get the trust of people so they are familiar with us and comfortable with us. And then at a certain point, I would go to them and say, okay, I would like to look at your phone, and I would like to discuss every single app on your phone, one by one. Now, a survey wouldn't have done, because half the apps on their phone they don't even use. They did once, they didn't like it, it's just there. Or their kids put it on when they were visiting, etc. So there is no other way of understanding this, I think, except going through every single app, one by one, developing stories. You know, when did you last use it? What happened? Often like health stories, when they were ill, etc., etc. And also, of course, watching them. Partly by participation, being on their WhatsApp groups, being on their Facebook, etc., communicating with them, using it together to go shopping, etc. But I think what's fundamental is that you don't understand a smartphone unless you do it at that level of detail. Because what they say about it, so those people, the same people who said I do 2 things, texting and phones, after we have finished going through the phone, typically there was older people using 25 to 30 different elements in their phone. Only 2 of which were mentioned. So surveys, no. Even if you then survey the apps, half of them aren't used. It just doesn't work. I can't see it that you can do anything other than what we did. Okay, which is that very, very detailed investigation, but it must be based on trust. They've got to be comfortable with you, that they're going to start telling you very private things that are going on with them. Because it's very private to us. And that's why we have our 16-month relationship in order to investigate it. Third element of your question was really about theory. And particularly, you were using a terminology, I would say, that originates in Marx, which effectively is a terminology that we constantly use because Marx was concerned effectively with the ruptures created by the conditions of capitalism, and particularly there are the three tropes of fetishism, reification, alienation, that in a sense then grow into other ways in which we theorize a sense of rupture. My first sort of main book to study these things was a book called Material Culture Mass Consumption, in which I argued why the way these have come down to us from Marx are problematic, and actually it was better to go to what I would see as the original Hegelian formulation of these ideas about the concept of objectification. And the difference between Hegel and Marx is that Hegel understood the condition of safe alienation as a necessary condition, but one that was usually overcome through the process actually of consumption. So we encounter something in the shop as a symbol of, say, capitalism. It's fully alienated, as it were, and doesn't necessarily represent labour. But then, in the process of consumption, it becomes something, you know, a shirt we've worn 3 times, is now very much ours and becomes a form of inalienability. And I think that not necessarily in a good way, it can be all sorts of problems that occur around those processes of consumption, comes into these issues of consumption. But I do think that, I don't have time to go into any detail, but I do think the theorization of these relationships, to my mind, for all sorts of reasons, start better from Hegel than from Marx. Because I think Hegel and other theorists like Zimmel, etc., saw the contradictions and actually saw also how people strive to overcome contradictions. Whereas for me, Marx and consequent literatures are flatter. They really focus on rupture and get kind of almost fixed there. And I think that's much less true to our actual engagement with the objects and the world around us. But that's, if you want the details of that, it's in a book called Material Culture Mass Consumption, but that's kind of the gist of where I would be in relation to that kind of terminology.
Thank you very much. Other question on the virtual classroom? Laura, go ahead.
Some Zoom questions. So, Gillette, if you want to turn on your microphone, please, the floor is yours. Okay, so maybe in the meantime for Dieter. Dieter, can you turn on your microphone for your question, if you want?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Am I to hear? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, fine, great. Yes, thank you, Daniel. I'm very happy to listen to your talk. When I started with some research on consumption issues in the 90s, I came across your book edition, Acknowledging Consumption, so very soon after its publication. So since then I know your name and I'm happy to have heard your talk now here because your presentation on smartphones and consumption gives insight into a very new world of digital communication. I mean, so new it may not be anymore, of course, but it's really a new world of non-face-to-face communication. And I think the previous question and also your answer, Daniel, is very interesting regarding with refugees, migration, and so on. The nature of migration has changed extremely due to the availability of smartphones, because people are not, when they migrate, are not so separated from their home families anymore through the availability of electronic communication. I have a very specific different question related to an own project or publication I'm just preparing, which is on internet communication or smartphone communication and web presence by small business owners. The question is, I mean, regular communication on smartphones is mostly, let's say, reciprocal between sender and recipient. It is mostly in a halfway democratic way. But communication and internet presence by business owners is just arrive potential customers. And they want to tell stories, they want to orchestrate narratives in order to give a positive image to arrive people and to maintain traffic on their websites. So the rationality is different because the platform activity is always, at least partially, of instrumental nature. Have you any ideas about this kind of smartphone communication and internet presence as a tool for business owners, whatever, to come into contact with potential customers?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Okay, the first one, as I said, I mean, Shireen is the expert on migrations, and this is a really important element, and she will deal with that. With regard, I mean, I have worked myself, and I have PhD students who are working on the development of e-commerce. And in a way, the picture that you just presented reflects, in some respects, I would say, a more traditional conceptualization of the relationship between business and customers. Because prior to the internet, if you think about marketing, it was, largely speaking, this kind of one-way relationship, that you had the brand or whatever it is you were trying to sell, and you put things out there in the hope that it would have this kind of consequence for consumers. I would have said, though, that while that may still be true for some small businesses, what we're finding in our work is that one of the most important consequences of things like internet and smartphones is that actually the situation becomes more fluid. I mean, obviously, one of the terms being used in this workshop, prosumption, in part deals with that, because sometimes it's now quite unclear as to who is the consumer and who is the producer. And a lot of the small businesses we're working on in China, for example, would be in that situation, that actually there is more, I would say. It's not as separated in the way that people tend to know more about who they're dealing with, and it's a more personal set of interactions that also are then used instrumentally for business, but don't have such a clear boundary as traditional businesses did. And also that actually a lot of these elements are also used for kind of feedback, that actually there are ways of evaluation what you did in your marketing. There is information you can gain, and I think even most small businesses now today would want to exploit the possibilities of the internet for having that looped relationship, which is not so much actually one way. And then you get, of course, sometimes you think about like TripAdvisor or something, and how that has affected every business in the hospitality world, right? That that actually the traditional forms of marketing have been, to some extent, rendered redundant, because actually the overwhelming force is the evaluation, not that they try to engage with, but that it's coming at them anyway, because people will say whether the meal was good, the hotel was good, etc., etc. So I would have thought that actually there are many profound implications of these changes, and they make for, and that's why I'm happy with words like presumption, because I think they actually do represent this more complex, this more fluid, this more plural, varied set of relationships between business. Having said all that, I would absolutely recognise that there is also some continuities. There will be small businesses that will be exactly the situation you described, where effectively this is simply a new media for all marketing.
So Gillette, did you want to?
Yeah, we have Gillette, if she can talk, and then we have also Melissa here in the room.
Hi Danny, it's nice to be able to do this face-to-face kind of. I really appreciated how you started your talk with the question of what exactly are platforms, and using the smartphone as a way to sort of enter into that examination. I had a slightly different question, and in some ways it goes back to this the duplicity that you created between the smartphone and the app / the platform. I wonder if, as part of this really multi-sided research looking at, whether you saw any continuities between the use of smartphones and feature phones. I bring this up because in India, for instance, there are many app makers now who are trying to incorporate a lot of the apps and features that you would see in smartphones, for instance, WhatsApp or other forms of digital money, into the feature phones themselves. So that's happening at the level of these companies. But on the other hand, for instance, this is something I'm going to be discussing in my talk tomorrow, we also came across particularly elderly users who would often use a combination of the smartphone and the feature phone. So smartphone to interact with the app, and the feature phone to interact with the people. So I'm just curious what you got from this.
Yes, thank you for the question. Okay, so during this particular, our previous project, the one on social media, where Sriram and Katjaram was working in Chennai, we had an India-based study. This one we didn't, but the place where the feature phone features most would actually be in our study in Japan, because different regions have different trajectories of phones. And the one where the feature phone probably was most important was actually in Japan, because there was a time when Japan was in the vanguard. And they produced what is locally called a garake, which is kind of in between mobiles. It's a feature phone, basically. And it came to dominate the Japanese market. So now then there's a question, what would be the relationship between the feature phone and the smartphone? And actually, there's something that will come out as a book by Nora Hapio-Kirk, which has a lot of detailed discussions of all that was in Japan. And what she found, which I think speaks to the talk I just gave, is there are technological questions in terms of what a smartphone can do that a feature phone can't do. But actually, almost more important than that is really what I talked about when I was talking about beyond anthropomorphism, which is what the phone speaks to as almost an embodiment of the person. And I don't have time for all the details, but one of the things she argues is that the difference between feature phones and smartphones is mainly crucial in Japan because of the way it affects gender relations. And the reason for that is that the feature phone became very involved in the world of work and a very male sense of their relationship to work, and a question of whether they retain that during retirement, etc. Whereas women were more focused on things like social connectivities and possibilities, and therefore what's happened in Japan is basically men have tried to hold on to garakes, and women have gone for smartphones. And it becomes quite an important reflection of the dynamics of gender relations in that. Now, there is no reason at all why that has to bear any relation to what's going on in India. But I think it's a point, though, because I think what it shows is that the whatever differences we're concerned with, in this case between feature phones and smartphones, lend themselves to symbolic distinctions, which may be embedded in gender, age, or all sorts of other parameters. And then it's very much an empirical question. I mean, I would love to know from you how that has played out in the Indian context, and that will then be interesting to compare to the Japanese context. But I would only be able to do that when we know from you what the Indian situation is. But it's certainly something that comes into our work, yes.
Okay. Melissa, you have a question? Yeah.
So thank you very much for your presentation, and I was very fascinated by this possibility of smartphones to influence care. And because I just read the Care Manifesto by the Care Collective, where they talk about community of care and promiscuous care. So I was wondering also, because you presented the bright sides of it, but I was wondering which are the dark sides. I was thinking, for example, about the individualization or the excessive responsibility on families and relatives, or also about the fact that they can also reduce and shrink the trust in the care system. For example, I have some symptoms and I go on the phone and I try to have a self-diagnosis about my illness, right? So I was simply wondering about this.
I think there's an even deeper problem with care, which comes out from a sensitivity to the situation of care even before we even get to the condition. And that is, we tend to deal with older people. And one of the issues that comes up in so many of the different places we work is about autonomy and dignity. That basically, the problem for older people, I mean, what the English will say all the time is, I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to, you know, I mean, I know they want to care for me, but I lose dignity, I lose my sense of myself, I lose so many things. So care is negative in that respect, fundamentally, before we even get to this, or at least it's contradictory. But obviously necessary. So you start, I think, really from that kind of contradiction. And then you look at the way the new technologies play into this. And since you asked for a negative example, I'll give you one. I just finished a paper about, and it's not really care, but I think it will do, about the consequences of Googling for health information. Now, there's probably nothing with greater consequence and more ubiquitous than the fact that everybody Googles health information, okay? So then the question is, what's the effect of that? And the paper I've written, we have a book that will be coming out about, because I didn't talk about today in enough time, about the health work that we've been doing. So it's about on ML, right? No matter that. So the point that comes out of ethnography is often these things have consequences you never really thought about. And the particular consequence that I was concerned with about Googling for health in Ireland was the impact it has on class relations. Okay? Why class relations? The reason is because what I found was that if you look at that society, there are people got a degree, good education, confident in their use of research, and by and large, when those people Google health information, they know which things not to look at, right? They may even, let's say they've done a degree, as many people have today, they would know even to go through and find the academic papers upon which the information was based. I know people that would do that, okay? I would do that. And by and large, that improves their understanding of their health condition. So those who are already, in a sense, nearer the top in terms of the way they can understand health information, their knowledge is improved. If you go down the other end of the scale, and you have people that didn't have that research capabilities or experience, they just go on Google. And the tendency then, particularly I think before COVID, was they would come across sites that either related to commercial interest or anxiety. Because the things that the media tend to promote are things that cause anxiety, because that promotes media. That's what newspapers do, for example. And similarly with Google. So everything means you're going to get cancer. And everything is catastrophic, etc. And the more they looked at, the more they were told, you know, all sorts of weird things that they should or shouldn't be doing in relation to these symptoms. And they would become, generally speaking, more anxious, more confused, less clear about what the hell was going on. And so the people who, as it were, had more got more, and the people who had less got less. And that is what my paper is about, is the way Googling for health exacerbates class differences, which never occurred to me until I did the study. So yes, I think that when it comes to things like care, one has to be alert to both the fundamentals and contradictions, like not wanting to be a burden and respect for autonomy, and then how that gets affected by these new possibilities of online. I mean, I have a much longer answer that would also look at how it affects the relationship to doctors and consultants, because I also studied that. But the point is, yes, there are negatives. If I have time to do it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Daniel. We really appreciate your contribution. As in the best Italian tradition, we have a short delay, so we do apologize for that. We are glad to host you downstairs for a short coffee break, and we will start the second session at 11:45. But before that, I would address a big thank to Laura Teravassi, Paolo Giglio, and Desins Florian. Without their help, this event wouldn't have been possible. Thank you very much.
Just one last thing, in case anybody isn't here this afternoon. The books that we're talking about, I have them here, but also, just to let you know, they are free, they are online. All you have to do is go to UCL Press, and they are no cost. You don't even have them for free. If you wanted print copies, you would pay for, and we have the print copies.